Well, hello everybody. I hope you had a Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year, or whatever we're supposed to say today. Um, Coming back to this, we're gonna do one last hurrah through Melanchthon's um, article on the distinction among foods. And this is, as we said, if you remember part one, part two, this is largely to do with fasting and the restrictions and, as he's saying, distinctions among foods. But as you've been following through, what have we been looking at here? Well, we've been looking at this fact that while this is titled The Distinction Among Foods, in large part, what this really is having to do with this problem of church traditions, or as some would say, man-made traditions, right? Running amok in the church, taking the place of the gospel, taking the place of the law, and also with the importance of the distinction between law and gospel. Because as we've seen throughout this whole thing, the main issue that Philip Melanchthon has here, and the same main issue he has with all of these other kinds of things, perversion of the mass, the perversion of the vestments, the perversion of the liturgy, the perversion of anything that can be perverted when it is perverted, is a perversion that looks like that thing being used to merit, and merit is a very specific word here, right? The forgiveness of sins. So, for example, when we look then at the Mass, right? What are we looking at? Well, we are looking at something that is for the forgiveness of sins, but when Melanchthon's using that terminology, when Luther is using that terminology, done to merit the forgiveness of sins, what's meant by that is that the Mass is no longer something that gives, the Mass is something done to render some kind of worth, some kind of value to God, so that He looks at you doing that and then says, okay, now you are deserving of this. And so it's this kind of capitalization of work done for righteous points, like an arcade token kind of system. And really, you can look at like, well, what's the actual thing that's going wrong there? It's probably that capitalization scheme, that whole schema, that paradigm of the law of works done for merits provided. Therefore, now you have a righteousness. Is that how God's acting? Well, there's some pictures of that we get. And yes, that language is used in the Book of Concord, operating in a kind of Anselmian paradigm, we could say in some ways, regarding Christ's merits. But we have to realize these things are done as motifs, not as the whole reality, right? And there's a whole broader kind of a conversation that needs to be had there, and it's been mentioned in parts of pretty much every video for the last 4 years now. So that does need to be said. Maybe in a longer way, maybe when we get Pastor Roland back rolling with us. But yeah, in when we look at the distinction of meats, we have to really understand that that issue is in the background here, right? And what that means is take that concept out of your mind for a second. Take the idea that you can merit or deserve, do anything making you deserving of salvation as payment, or salvation as reward for works that you did, right? Or that this fasting is a work being done to merit your salvation. So don't even just take that out of the picture. Take the whole idea of God asking you to do something to make yourself worthy of His love. Take that idea out of the picture altogether. Well, is fasting going to be a problem then? No. Are vestments going to be a problem then? No. Is the Mass going to be a problem then? No, right? So really, the actual problem at the base of this all is, as I've been saying, it is the matter of the law gospel distinction. It is this matter of us thinking we can do something, that's law, to earn God's love, which is freely given as a gift of the gospel, right? It's when we confuse this idea of who is God, what kind of disposition does the Father have toward me, and do my works change that? Do my prayers change that? Does my faith change that, right? Do I have an evil God that hates me who turns into a God who loves me when I quote unquote believe in him, whatever that means? No, right? And so when you take that out of the issue, not only does our theology become less full of problems, but so also do our practices cease to be the problems written about here in Melanchthon's Augsburg Confession. So we left off. I think I said it was 30. At least that's how I titled it on the YouTube notes. But looking at it here, it looks like there might be some more to say with 31 and 32. So let's just jump in right there. 31 and 32. For concerning the Holy Cross, they have always taught that Christians are obliged to suffer. And this, we can bring that back into the context. Well, what does that mean in regard to the distinction of meats? It's this. Christians being required to suffer has meant for some that Christians therefore need to practice fasting to kind of summon or conjure up sufferings in their life, right? And that doing so, it is proper and real, not contrived mortification. In addition, it is also taught that all are obliged to conduct themselves regarding bodily discipline. Again, how does that relate to fasting? One such mode is fasting, right? And so he says here, such as fasting and other work, in such ways as not to give occasion to sin, but not as if they earn grace by such works. And so you have two things here: the obligation of suffering, right? Leading us to say, which is kind of funny to me, right? And it's funny to me because when you read Luther on the matter of, well, should we fast to kind of conjure or summon sufferings? Luther says, no. But like a good monk, rather, he's saying, let the Father be kind of your abbot, if you will, in the monkhood of all believers. There are going to be manifold sufferings in your life. You don't need to make more. At the same time, fasting does bring us into that point of the cross where we are distanced from our luxuries, where we're distanced from our comforts, where we're distanced from this mode of life where everything is about our self pleasure and our gratification and our um, doing anything we can to avoid being uncomfortable for even a second, and focusing as much as we can on serving the self and buffeting the self, if you will. You know what I mean? And so we have this other matter then of bodily discipline. It's the same idea, right? Like why is suffering good for you? Well, in one, someone could make the case that, well, it has to do with us wanting to embody the cross and walk in the way of the cross, this walk of the cruciform life. I get that. At the same time, the most practical benefit of this, the real practical focus of this is discipline. It is making ourselves stronger for the time of suffering to come, but it is also focused upon and in upon that need to not just strengthen you, but to keep yourself focused on what matters, which is not the self-gratification, but the service toward others. So he says then, such bodily discipline should not be limited only to specific days. That is, of this idea of the fasting schedule. However, I will say, though it should not be limited to those days are helpful in the same way that we see, for example, in Luther's Large Catechism. It's the same idea. Although the one is obviously far more important, such as this. I'm speaking of the Sabbath law, right? Where Dr. Luther says, no, it's true. There is not commanded by God any longer for us in our context to worship him and receive his word and sacraments on Sunday. However, for practical purposes, it is necessary to enforce a day. And this goes back to what was said in episode 1 on this same article and episode 2 on this same article, is that, for example, while God doesn't say we need to wear clothes in the service, we do say you need to wear clothes. We are just not saying you need to wear these specific clothes as a law of God to merit your salvation. And so there's this whole kind of nuance upon nuance upon nuance. Where does adiaphora, as it's so called, run rampant? When does it get out of line? When does it get off the leash? Those are important questions to sort of be asking, and they're being asked here, right? So, for example, is setting a specific day of fasting a bad thing? Well, Melanchthon's going to give us his ideas on this idea, or on that kind of question. But at the same time, There's a big difference between saying this is a day you have to fast or else you sinned in not fasting on that day versus saying we set up this specific day so that we can together remember to fast because it's so easy not to, or to have a day where we remember the importance of bodily discipline because it's so easy not to. However, Melanchthon's countering that idea also with a healthy dose of reminders that we need bodily discipline every day. We need to, in some sense, have a fasting and a feasting state every day. Of course, you can't literally fast and feast in that kind of culinary sense every single day. You're going to have to choose one or the other, right? Unless you're saying, I'm going to fast 70% of the day and feast at the end. That's not healthy for you either. So, anyways, let's look at what he says here. He says here, this should not be limited only to specific days, but should be maintained continually, day after day, that is. Christ speaks about this in Luke 21:34. Be on guard so that your hearts are not weighed down with dissipation. And Mark 9:29, the kind of demon can come out only through prayer and fasting. Paul says that he punished his body and enslaved it, indicating that mortification should not serve the purpose of earning grace. So again, what's the real issue Melanchthon's speaking of? It's that idea of earning grace by works done, right? So he says, but of keeping the body in a condition that does not prevent it from performing duties required by one's calling. So fasting itself, Melanchthon says here, is not rejected. And we need to fully understand that. However, he says, instead we reject making it a required service with prescribed days and foods, for this confuses the consciences. So let's break this down, because I know that some will be tempted to say, well, if above he's saying it's important to fast, if above he's saying it's important to render bodily discipline every day, but as, for example, Pastor Connor has said, he's brought up this matter of large catechism on the third commandment of the Sabbath day and how there's a distinction between a necessity of God instituting a day and a necessity of practicality for the sake of reminding us and ordering us for the sake of order, right? Practicality. Where do we land on this? And what's Melanchthon saying? It's Melanchthon saying, are we confessing as a church that we cannot actually set specific fasting days in the church? Well, no. And you have to read it this way, right? A required service. Well, what is that? Well, earlier, Melanchthon said the same thing about the laws of God and the laws of Moses. These are things that were required at that time, and now we are not requiring it, right? But what is the difference here? And if you're saying, maybe I don't have go back and watch those two videos, right? But the context was this. Melanchthon was speaking of a service to God for rendering salvation unto ourselves. That's not allowed, right? However, should we require the service done for the good of bodily discipline? Possibly, in a practical sense. But to break that is not to sin. We need to understand that. That's a nuance that needs to be brought in here for our own sake, right? However, so then what do we say of, for example, the church's sanctoral cycle, where, for example, we'll enter into Lent eventually. We just ended Advent. Advent is a fasting season. Lent is a fasting season. Wednesdays and Fridays are fasting seasons. Ember days, Ember weeks are fasting seasons. Do we get rid of those because that's somehow a burden to the consciences? No, but what we do is we say, this is a fasting season, but that doesn't mean it's a sin to not do it, And we also don't say, for example, we can say, yeah, there is traditional Western guidelines on how to fast, and there is patristic guidelines on how to fast, and there is monastic guidelines on how to fast, right? But nobody's saying if you don't follow one or the other that you're sinning. These are ideas, these are suggestions, these are traditions, these are practical, inclinations, if you will, right? So he says then our side also retains many ceremonies and traditions, such as the order of the Mass and other singing things, festivals, and the like, which serve to preserve in the order in the church. And that's really what I'm saying is Just as with the festal things, so also the fasting things, when we do preserve them, because you can't say, for example, yeah, we preserve fasting, but not as a seasonal thing, not as a Wednesday and Friday thing, but as a continual thing. No, you don't. If you say that to yourself, you're lying, or you don't understand human nature. If you say that you're gonna fast every day, you're gonna fast none of the days. This is how human beings work. This is how they function. If we don't actually set up and this is the same thing with the third command, right? As Luther's saying, is it a law that you worship God on Sunday? No, right? But he says, but for the sake of order, for the sake of practicality, we do this because we do need to worship. And that is divine law, just not the specific day, right? So also with fasting, do you need to fast in a legal sense? No, but do you need to fast for the sake of your bodily discipline, for the good of your neighbor, for yourself, for your own sanctification? Yeah, probably. Sometime, right? Sometime you should do that, right? Am I going to say you should do it every time? No, not necessarily. Am I going to say you should do it whenever you feel like? No, and I'm not going to do that because if I say you should do it whenever you feel like, you're never going to do it. And we see the same thing with, for example, private confession and absolution. What has happened with the way that that's been treated in our society, in the age of over Protestantization of Lutheranism? What has happened to private confession and absolution? It's been thrown out the window because what happened? Well, everybody emphasized the whole confess privately when you feel the need to, and they said, "Well, I just don't feel the need to," as though that was a fine thing to say, right? Rather than being concerned with the fact that in these latter days, nobody seems to be concerned with their sin. Nobody seems to be concerned with the things that should impact their consciences, and then they boast that they have such good, strong, faithful consciences in Christ. That's not true. You just have a really small view of your sin and its impact on your soul and on those around you. Just so with this fasting thing, right? I think that a lot of the reason why fasting has become so unpopular is because people, well, first of all, they lack reading comprehension. And second of all, they lack a kind of sense of the context in which this was operating in versus their own. In Melanchthon's own context, everybody was fasting, but it was done for earning salvation, which is heretical and obviously awful and not even the teaching of Rome, at least not currently, right? So, does it make sense to come down really hard on fasting, not to get rid of it, but to say you really need to stop that and emphasize how fasting can become a problem, a hindrance to Orthodox Christian faith? Of course it does. But in a time where nobody is fasting, everyone is overindulging, everyone is overly gluttonous, is insisting upon a return to a fasting spirit of the church, good? Yes, obviously it is, right? So we need to understand that as well. Now, Melanchthon says here, at the same time, however, the people are taught that such external worship, and this has to do with the festal stuff and the tradition stuff, that these external forms of our worship do not make them righteous before God. So again, we come back to this, and this is why I say it's so important when we're going through these things where one side says, "Oh, you're being too Catholic," and the other side says, "You're not being Catholic enough." We need to read with full reading comprehension the actual confessions of our church and say, well, what's their actual point? Is the actual point that fasting is too Catholic? No. Is the actual point that vestments are too Catholic? No. Is the actual point that we should be afraid of tradition because it's not commanded by God? No, actually. It's almost always only about this one thing, that the gospel be kept distinct from the law and that it be protected and not replaced. That's it. Right? So, as Melanchthon's been saying, he said this like 10 times now. The problem with fasting in the church is that at his time, it had been done to merit salvation, to merit righteousness before God, rather than receive freely from his hand in word and sacrament. That's the problem, right? And so he says, the people are taught that such external worship of God does not make them righteous before God, and that it's to be observed without burdening consciences, and so also fasting needs to be done in the same way. That is, by no one sinning, by omitting it, or without causing offense. Now, the ancient fathers also maintained such liberty with respect to external ceremonies, and this includes fasting as well. For in the East, the festival of Easter was celebrated at a date different from that as in Rome, when some wanted to divide the church over this difference, and we've seen that in these latter times, even Orthodox against Orthodox, because they operate on different calendars. He says others admonish them that there was no need for having such uniformity in these customs. As Irenaeus says, diversity in fasting does not dissolve unity in faith. However, we stop there for a second. Some people have taken this to mean something that's not said at all by Irenaeus, which is we should not be concerned with fasting at all because it's too Catholic. Or fasting doesn't matter to the church at all because God did not command it. Or I don't want to fast. I've never fasted. I didn't grow up fasting. Nothing like that. Fasting, if you read the early church fathers, just as Melanchthon is saying, it's important to do so. And when you do so, you will read that diversity in fasting is totally fine. However, there is no father that says it's fine if you don't bother yourself with fasting at all. There's a big difference there, right? So we need to understand that just as in the scriptures in the Holy Fathers, fasting is presumed. It is assumed that you're doing that, and you should. And so he says, furthermore, concerning such diversity in human ordinances, what is this? What does this stand for? Whatever this is, also states that they are not in conflict with the unity of Christendom. The Tripartite History, Book 9, gathers many examples of diverse customs in the church and establishes a useful Christian, saying it was not the intention of the apostles to institute festivals, but to teach faith and love. And so again, even with that last quote from Tripartite History, Book 9, does that mean that it was not the intention of the apostles to have a church that fasts? To have a church that feasts? No. No, it wasn't, right? And so we need to take these things in a balanced sort of way, understanding that, what's been said about this, what's been said when we covered the Mass, what's been said, what will be said about monastic vows. The problem that the Book of Concord has with these things is not that they exist, is actually not that they were not commanded by God, is not actually that there is no promise attached to them. And so we need to be careful, because I hear all the time from laity in every single corner of the Lutheran Church, oh, I'm not going to do X, Y, or Z thing. I'm not going to fast. I'm not going to pray the liturgy of the hours. I'm not going to do this or that and the other thing because there's no command of God to do it. There's no promise to do it. And they think they're being so uber Lutheran when they do that. It's not the case. They're being largely unwise. You look at the Book of Concord, what is the problem that the Book of Concord has with all of these things when they go awry? Well, it's that they are done to merit justification, personal righteousness from God because of your works being so good. That's the problem. When that's not happening, these things retain their goodness and their benefit to the soul who does them. Do you understand that? And so, with fasting, when we don't do it to merit our justification, but we do it for bodily discipline, we are not hurting ourselves, but helping ourselves. In the same way, then, and this might sound too strong for some people, when you refuse to do it because you are justified in Christ, you show yourself unwise and undisciplined, using the forgiveness of Christ as an agent or motivation for laziness, which is bad. Don't do that. Okay? So what's been said here? We should be doing fasting. We should be doing feasting. How should we do it? Well, your church already has a sanctoral cycle laid out for you to do that. Fast in Advent, fast in Lent. How do you want to do that? Do it however you want, but if you don't know how, you can look at the guidelines, the traditions of the church. Again, is it a sin if you refuse to? No. But it might be unwise. And that's all that we have to say on the matter, right? All right, God bless you all. Have a lovely rest of the second week of Christmas. And when I see you again, I think we'll be in Epiphany season. So God's peace, God's blessings, God's gracious presence be with you all today. Bye-bye.